So Hagar becomes Keturah, and then Avraham Avinu marries her again. What could that teach us about the power of teshuvah, the impact on other people, and generally speaking, what we are meant to do in terms of bringing other people to spiritual life? So it's all based on a Rashi, and the Rashi is on the pasuk Vayosef Avraham Vayikach Isha Shma Keturah, that Avraham added, or he again went and married a woman, an additional woman called Keturah. So Rashi is Rashi Meforish. Rashi explains Keturah Zay Hagar. Who's Keturah? It's Hagar. So why is she called Keturah? And Chris Keturah al shem shenoi maaseh ki Keturas. She was called Keturah because her deeds were so pleasant; they were like the aroma of the Keturas. And that she was very chaste and tied herself not to be exposed to other people and was not with any other man after Avraham Avinu. So, a few things we need to understand from what Rashi's told us. Number one, Aleph, was is the herchech from Pshutei Shel Mikra as Keturah Zoi Hagar? Rashi usually wants to tell us what the simple understanding of the Psukim is. So what in the simple understanding of the Psukim alludes to the fact that Hagar is now known as Keturah? Ve'adarabah. In fact, from Pashtus L'Shain HaKosov, the simple language of the pasuk indicates the opposite. Vayosef Avraham. Avraham now added a wife. Vayikach Isha Shma Gomer. And he took an additional wife. His mashma, that according to Pshat would imply as Vayikach Isha mein do'anaya lekichas Isha, which surely indicates the marriage of a brand new person, benoisav tzidya Friedeke, who is over and above his previous wives, via frek take medrash v'oksi Vayosef, which the medrash actually asked. Doesn't it say Vayosef? In other words, in addition to Sarah, who had now passed away, and even in addition to Hagar, who was previously a wife of Avraham Avinu. Where in Pshat is there even the slightest hint that Keturah equals Hagar? Number two, look at the language of Rashi. Beis. Rashi gives us two reasons why her name would be called Keturah, and he links the two of them with a vav, with an and. First, he tells us that Keturah indicates that her deeds were so pleasant, like the Keturas. That she, so to speak, closed her entrance. In other words, ensured that she was chaste, that she wasn't available to any other person. Rashi doesn't put it as an alternative view or any other language that would indicate that there are two separate explanations. So his move on, it's clear from that, as Rashi learned, that the way Rashi interprets this is, as das is nit zwei bazundere pirushim v'im medrash. It's not two different explanations of how she got the name Keturah, because that's how the medrash presents it. Favos nikus Keturah. Not zwei taimim in ein pirush. It's one explanation with an A and a B, with two parts to it. Das heißt, as der Name Keturah is merames auf die beide Abteitschen zusammen. In other words, Rashi is taking the view that the name Keturah represents both aspects simultaneously. Leshoin Keturas, Keturah from the word Keturas, Shenoi Maseh Keturas, which implies that her deeds were as pleasing as the aroma of the Keturas. And also Keturah, like in Aramaic, is Leshoin Keshira, the expression of tying a knot. Veshekosha Pischa v'chulei, which implies that she closed herself off to any other relationship. So then we have to understand from wann nimmt Rashi, on what basis does Rashi take that view? Lefi pshutei shel mikra, again, bearing in mind that Rashi's approach is always aligned with the simplest understanding of the psukim. As melte gerufen Keturah tzlib zwei taimim. Where in the pasuk does it indicate that she's called Keturah? For two reasons. Nit ve'em medrash has das einen zwei pirushim, which is totally different to the medrash. It seems to make a lot more sense that there are two opinions why she's called Keturah. Rashi is saying she's called Keturah for two reasons. How does he know that? And then a very troubling question. Gimel dikushas HaMefarshim, quite a number of the Mefarshim ask this question. When the pasuk said in last week's parasha that Hagar left Avraham Avinu's house and then wandered around in the desert, Rashi says wandering around means that she went back to the idolatrous practices of her father's home. So how does the same Rashi now tell us that her deeds were as pleasing as the Keturas? Really doesn't sound right. So to bear in them, to understand all of this, what forces Rashi to say that Keturah must be a Hagar is a kasha, is a specific question, not in dem protistikum pasuk, that doesn't only apply to the words of this pasuk, hey, who is Keturah, Now in dem klolistik and sipur from Avraham and Hagar, actually what's bothering Rashi is something that relates to the entire story of the interactions between Avraham and Sarah. Why? Because how's it possible that Avraham Avinu could influence everybody except those closest to him? Rashi has already told us, as Avraham megayeres hanoshim, v'Sarah megayeres hanoshim, that Avraham Avinu brought men into the belief of Hashem, as Sarah did to the women. Heint. So now let's work this out logically. If Avraham Avinu was such a powerful individual who could influence people who were outside of his circle, outside of his family, and turn them into Gerim, surely then he could have had just as powerful an influence, if not more, over his own family, which means even Yishmael got involved in bad influences. We still see that at the end Yishmael did tshuva, and even while Avraham Avinu was still alive. That therefore presents this question: how could it be then that Yishmael does tshuva, but Hagar goes back to idolatry? When Avraham had nicht gefragt, as is tshuva ton, and there's no record that Avraham Avinu had an impact on her at any point, even subsequently, to do tshuva, how's that possible? Now don't try and say, oh, it's because distance. They didn't have internet. And don't suggest that it's because Hagar was too far for Avraham to influence. Because as we know, Avraham Avinu, on Sarah's advice, kicked Yishmael and Hagar out of his house. Because by the time the Akedah happened, which was already in the previous parasha, that whole distance and separation and chasing them out of the house was over. Rashi taichdem pasuk, as Rashi interprets on the pasuk that says Avraham Avinu traveled es shnei ne'arav with his two young assistants. Who were they? Says Rashi, Yishmael ve'Eliezer. Yishmael's one of the two. And in Pashtus, and in logic says, if Yishmael was back in town, so was Hagar, especially when you remember that Hagar is the one who made a shidduch for Yishmael from one of the daughters of Mitzrayim in that same time period. So she was obviously there. So how is it possible? Hagar is within reach. How is it that Avraham Avinu doesn't appear to have influenced her to do tshuva for having engaged in idolatry? To answer that, if them sagt Rashi Keturah say Hagar v'nikas Keturah chulei, that's why Rashi says Keturah must be Hagar, and she now has this positive behavior. Azayna chanami, that's taka true. The fact that the Torah now identifies Hagar by a new name, Keturah, meint the pasuk zu merames, and the intention of the pasuk is to allude to us as it zayin shoy noi masek Keturah, that she's now a different person to who she was when she went wandering back in the pagan fields of her father and her family. She's now somebody else, somebody whose deeds are as pleasing as the Keturahs. V'azyat taka tshuva geton. She actually has done tshuva for having re-engaged idolatry. That's what prompts Rashi to say Keturah is Hagar, and it addresses this very powerful question. And look at Rashi's language; you'll see it in the language. How does Rashi say it? He says Keturah zoy Hagar. Keturah is Hagar. Nit he Hagar. Even though there are other ways that would have worked just as well and said the same message, she is Hagar, he Hagar, like we say, he Chevron, such a place is such a place. Because he Hagar, Alashain Nistar, the point about he is its third person, so it indicates that we're talking about somebody who is not present. Volt gemeint, that would indicate, as da by deep psukim, red Canaanit vegan Hagar, that in these psukim, he Hagar, she's someone else. She's not in these psukim. She's nistar. She's third person. She's not the subject of this conversation. She's nistar. She's somebody who's invisible at this point in time. Hagar, by saying she, or this more correctly, not she is Hagar, this is Hagar, that tells us Hagar is present in this conversation. So the Ben Chomesh halt in ein Teinen, was tut sich mit Hagar? So this 5-year-old who's learning Chumash is wondering, where's Hagar? What happened to Hagar? What's the end of his story? Why don't we see any evidence that she does tshuva? How's that even possible? On the Rebbe Rashi Medayek, Zoi Hagar. So Rashi addresses that by saying, this is Hagar. You want to know what happened to her? This is what happened to her. Here we are talking about that self-same Hagar who lost her inspiration for a period of time and fell off the bandwagon. And you were worried about her and you were asking about her. Well, this is her, and she's now rehabilitated. So what's Rashi telling us? She did tshuva, therefore her deeds are beautiful like the Keturos, but it's not enough of an explanation. Because even though, yes, we can identify that now, at the time of this story, when Avraham takes her back, she is a balas tshuva and she is good. But because her history includes a chapter where she went back to bad behavior, surely Avraham Avinu, who is the ultimate level of personal modesty, surely he would never have reinvited her to be his wife again. If there was even a whiff of the possibility that she'd been with another man in the interim. So yes, she's holy and her deeds are good, but Avraham Avinu is going to keep an arm's length from somebody who might have been with another man. Especially when you consider the context as der pasuk vayosef Avraham gomer, this pasuk that says that Avraham Avinu remarried, Kumbald Nochen pasuk is immediately following the pasuk of his own son's marriage. That not only did Yitzchak marry, but he married Rivka, who was of the caliber to reinstate all the miracles of the tent of Sarah. The context is we're talking about people who are the most modest people around, Sarah and Rivka. And compared now, we're talking about Avraham Avinu. It's not possible that Avraham Avinu would have entertained the remotest possibility of a wife who had been with another man. That's why Rashi has to say, and besides the fact that her current status is that she's got beautiful behavior like the Keturos, and she was chaste even when she was off the rails. As in dem Nomen Keturah is that within that name Keturah, it also alludes to the fact that she did not align herself, she did not build a relationship with any other man in the interim after she had left Avraham Avinu's house. And that's why it was acceptable and appropriate for Avraham Avinu to take her back as a wife for a second time. So we got this beautiful understanding and insight. Now we know why it's Keturah, and we know why there are two explanations, or two parts to the explanation about her name. Now, with that in mind, Nomen Keturah is the pasuk as Hagar. What's Keturah illustrating to us? That Hagar durch Avram's hashpah, because of Avram's direct influence, tshuva giton, she did tshuva. That will help us to now explain the story again at a deeper level, according to the more mystical dimensions of Torah, at the cheprotim in pasuk, specifically elements of the pasuk that perhaps we didn't have such a depth of understanding until now. Details that didn't seem to be so smooth, certainly not from a spiritual perspective. Number one, simple question. Everybody should have been thinking about this question. That is Aleph. Ve'baldas Keturah zoi Hagar. If, as Rashi said, Keturah, this is Hagar, same person. Yosef Avraham Gomer. Then how do you say that Avraham added a wife? He's not adding a wife. He's reinstating an ex-wife. As mentioned, that's the question the Medrash asks. Now, Pshat is in Kinkashia. Okay, on a simple level, perhaps it's not the biggest question, or maybe not even a question at all. That yes, Keturah is Hagar, but it's the same person starting a new relationship. Avraham Avinu is now taking her as a wife, so to speak, for the first time. You can use the expression by Yosef. He added her again as a wife. It works according to Pshat. In fact, even beyond that, her whole status of wife is far superior to what it was before. Remember, Sarah Imenu said to Avraham Avinu, Boi no el shifchasi. She still had the status of being a shifcha, a maidservant, which is a very lowly status in context of yuchsin, context of marriage. On his start, Avraham genommen als Isha. Here the pasuk tells us that Avraham added a wife. That's a much higher status. And even al kol ponim ve'apilegesh, even if she wasn't a full wife but only a concubine, in the Meifim for Noshim B'Chsuva Pilakshin Men it was Beloi Kusuva, where the distinction between a wife and a concubine is whether or not they have the rights to claim a Ksuva. Still, Heitzas Memela Aninu from Vayosef and Derkichas Isha, he's added a dimension to their relationship. Prior to this, she was just a maidservant, and now she has a place at the table. She's part of the family. Okay, so according to Pshat, we can understand the word Vayosef. Still, the word Vayosef will be much clearer and more palatable when we look from the perspective of Chassidus. And we'll see how. Okay, so question 1, why the Vayosef? Question 2, there are many ways that the Torah could have alluded to the fact that Hagar behaved in a nice, beautiful way. Why specifically a way that connects with the Keturah? What's the symbolism of Keturah that tells us or gives us an insight into Hagar's tshuva? And lastly, Gimel, how come it is that the Torah alluded to this whole story that Hagar did tshuva only now? At the point where we're told that Avraham Avinu is marrying her. Why is now the time to know that information? So the Bir and Dem, in order to understand this, Chassidus explains the various stages of Avraham Avinu's avodas Hashem, particularly the difference before he had a bris versus after he had a bris. Chassidus is before, you'll see this in Torah Oyer. Chassidus is before the Chilek zwischen der Avodah von Avraham far sein Mol sein und der Avodah was noch dem. So Chassidus makes a very big distinction between the kind of avodah that Avraham Avinu did before the bris and subsequent to the bris. Avram, his name before he had a bris was Avram, which implies was meant Avram, a father who is very elevated. There is der Heben and abgetragen von Welt, which means elevated to the point of being beyond real connection to this physical world. Ram al kol goyim, like the pasuk says, exalted beyond all of the nations, or even beyond their perceptions and beyond their philosophies. And therefore, at that stage, his entire focus of spiritual development was all in the world of holiness and just in the world of holiness. But after the bris, the hay is inserted into his name. It's a whole new name with a whole new meaning. Av Hamoin Goyim. That now he's the father of many nations. Nations meaning people who live in the physical world and are immersed in materialism. And that now empowers Avraham Avinu to have an impact on ordinary people, nations of the world, even pagan people, and elevate them to Kedusha. So originally, he didn't engage in that. He worked in the spiritual realms, and now we see Avraham Avinu affecting the world. On die Avodah is given durch Sarah. Sarah is the one who helped facilitate Avraham Avinu's impact on the world. Why Sarah? What Sarah Imenu successfully did is removed the nonsense, the rubbish of the physical world, and elevated the sparks of potential and holiness. That's why she is the one who advises Avraham Avinu that Yishmael's got to go and Hagar has to go, because the pseiles, the dregs, they've got to go. Und der Eloi, was Avraham hatte gekriegt nach Ptiras Sarah, what did Avraham Avinu then succeed in mastering only after Sarah Imenu passed away? Similar kind of avodah of impacting the world by taking a woman called Keturah. That specifically, not only do we chase out the negative, but we actually bring the negative to tshuva. Yishmael and Hagar do tshuva. Which means that impurities that Sarah Imenu chased out of the picture, now Avraham Avinu is empowered not only to remove them, but to rehabilitate and transform them. Let's understand this. The Asborin them. The birin goyim v'satzachuf getan durch Sarah. The way that Sarah Imenu impacted and elevated the goyim, meaning the world, the physical, the material, is not klipas noigavas is mu'urav von tov unra. Sarah Imenu's impact was only on that part of klippa which has potential within it. Klipas noiga, it has negative, but it also has positive. So get rid of the negative and salvage the positive. The way you approach klipas noiga is you've got to remove the impurities, and then then elevate the potential goodness that was entrapped within it. And because when you're working in that way, the impurities don't seem to have any value, the only way to deal with it is get rid of it. But the way to rehabilitate or refine or transform Hagar and Yishmael is it's not to identify some deeply embedded goodness within them and then extract it and elevate it. Because there isn't such potential. The only way to rehabilitate them is to introduce something new that appeared never to be there before. Like a person who's done a terrible Aveira, but then does an incredible Teshuvah, now that Aveira gets added into the world of holiness. Previously it had no relationship with holiness, and now it is brought into the world of holiness as an added value. That's what Avraham Avinu does. He adds a new value to the world of holiness that previously was not only not there, but not even there in potential. Which answers the three questions we asked. It answers why it says that Avraham added by taking a wife called Keturah. Because that concept of totally transforming something which was an impurity, gimel klipas hatameyos, part of the three absolutely impure elements of the world, is an infonoisofa. That's something that adds to the world what was never there before. But the Tzemach Tzedek Taishtem Pasuk, similar to how the Tzemach Tzedek explains the Pasuk that Rachel Imenu said after Yosef was born, she immediately said, Yosef Hashem li ben acher, may Hashem add to me another son. The Tzemach Tzedek says there's a whole layer of depth within this. As the inyum von Yosef, the concept of Yosef, hoisofa, adding value, is das was man macht as von an acher soll werden a ben, is achieved by taking something that is acher, that is foreign, that is distant, that is an oisvorf, and turning it into a ben, somebody who's part of the family. That's exactly what Avraham Avinu is doing over here. He's taking Hagar and Yishmael, who were kicked out of the reservation, and bringing them into the family through the process of tshuva. That's a hisofa. That's adding something that previously was not there, and it adds in two ways. And the hisofa is bishtayim. The 2 degrees or 2 elements of this addition. Number one, the obvious, Aleph, in Welt. It adds a new dimension and consciousness to the world. So, you're adding something and innovating something brand new within creation. Because within the rules of nature and the rules of creation, it's actually not possible to take something negative and turn it into positive, to take a wanton transgression and turn it into a credit. It's not possible. So we're now adding a new dimension within the world. Secondly, Beis in Avraham, it adds something to Avraham Avinu that previously was not part of his spiritual experience. Vayosef Avraham Goimer. The literal translation is Avraham added something to his life, a new woman. But actually it means Vayosef Avraham, he added to Avraham, he added to himself. That concept of totally revolutionizing the dimensions of absolute impurity is something that can only be achieved with the power of Hashem's essence. Because when you look from the perspective of Hashem's essence, is B'Lashon HaMedrash, if we can borrow an expression from the Medrash, that it's not clear which the Eibishter prefers, us or everybody else. Does the Eibishter love the behavior of the pious or of the wicked? On der Fall, was die Söhne seine dort nicht teifes mocken. In other words, what we're saying is from the perspective of Hashem's essence, even the worst transgressions are meaningless. So when you're at that elevated perspective, if the negative doesn't make a difference, doesn't make an impact, then you can completely transform it into positive. Und das der Pirsch von Vayosef Avraham Gomer. That's the real meaning of the addition to Avraham. As durch dem, was bei Avraham ist, nitosef geworden, a hechere koyach v'darga. It means that because Avraham Avinu was now empowered with a whole different, higher dimension of spirituality, was nennt sich von Atzmos, that was provided to him and draws itself from Hashem's essence, therefore, hat gekent uftan dem Biri in Hagar v'Yishmael. That's what empowered him to be able to transform people who previously had been completely separate from holiness, Hagar and Yishmael, and now incorporate them into holiness. Vayosef Avraham Avinu had an added dimension of power and ability brought into his experience. Beis, it also helps us to understand why we say specifically Shenoi Maseh Kiktoiras Dafka, why we Dafka say that, what illustrates how pleasing Hagar's behavior was, that it's like Ketoiras of all things. Why? It's well known that Chassidus explains the reason there are specifically 11 ingredients of Ketoiras, because normally 10 is the number of holiness. Is because Keteris has the power of transforming the 11 core energy centers of impurity to become holy. 11 is always a number of impurity because it's an entire system. 10 is always an entire system. Plus the fact that there has to be an external power element because impurity can't live on its own. So it relies on external power from Kedusha. That's why it's the number 11. Ketoris is 11 ingredients to neutralize, and not only neutralize, but transform all of that negativity to become positive. And lastly, Gimel, and this is going to be a big subject we'll discuss in the Sicha. The Tachlis from Yikachisha is, what's the reason for marriage? Pru Uravu Goimer, to expand the family, to have people, to populate the world. The concept of birth is obviously a concept of adding and innovating within the world. Und damit ist Musber, was die Tshuva von Hagar, therefore it makes sense that Hagar's Tshuva, was in Yonah is a Sofa canal, which we've already mentioned, is not just Tshuva, but it's a complete revolution that adds something to the world that you wouldn't have even imagined potentially possible in the world. Where do we mention it? Not in any arbitrary part of the story, but specifically in the part of the story that speaks about marriage, which allows the opportunity of bringing new life into this world. The purpose of marriage is to, as the parasha is going to tell us, to have children, which means to add new life where previously that life wasn't available, wasn't part of the world, and that's exactly what happens with Hagar. Some new life comes into the world by transforming Hagar to become a decent human being. Now, pasuk is Sipur Tomur b'Yosel Chere in Gemara. Now that we're talking about Keturah, let's visit a story in the Gemara Zvachim, which is a very strange story. Story goes like this: Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Tarfon's nephews, his wife's, his sister's children were sitting with him. Rashi says they weren't saying anything, which means they weren't sharing anything of Torah. So Rabbi Tarfon decided to initiate conversation, as Rashi says, Gedei Dabru, that hopefully they'll get to talk. And he started by saying, Vayosef Avraham. Avraham took another wife, Vayikach Isha Ushma Yoichni. And he says that who was the new wife? A woman called Yoichni. Rashi says that he was just making a comment that was out of line or out of context just to try and stimulate some conversation. So he succeeded. They responded. They said to him, Keturah Ksiv. What are you calling her Yoichni? Her name is Keturah. So he said, you children of Keturah. It's neat movement. It's a really strange story with a whole lot of questions that we have to ask. Firstly, Favosta tells us the Gemara Bechal, why does the Gemara even engage us with the story? Especially when you consider that the Torah is so cautious not even to speak in a disparaging way about a non-kosher animal. Surely then the Gemara should be so careful not to speak in a negative way about Rabbi Tarfon's family, his nephews. So there has to be some lesson, otherwise the Gemara would never have gone into this conversation. So, was is dehira? What's the lesson for us? Question 1. Question 2 is, if you feel that there's too much silence in the environment, you need somebody to talk. There are many methods to instigate a conversation. You don't have to misquote a pasuk in order to start a conversation. Why does Rabbi Tarfon do that? Gimel, third question. How is it acceptable to use a pasuk of the Torah because you need to start a conversation? Torah is not there for our benefit. We're there to serve as Torah, to learn Torah. And lastly, which is possibly the question that probably jumped out first, why of all the names that he chose, did he choose Yochni? If he wanted to say anything, at least he should have said Hagar. Hagar is who the person is. Even though Hagar would be a misquote of the pasuk, at least it would be conveying the same content. At least according to most commentaries, they say Keturah is Hagar. And even if you want to say there are those who insist that Keturah was not Hagar, we know that even when you have a disagreement and Torah was somebody else, you acknowledge that their version is also Torah. Which is why you see that even when there's a debate between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel are willing to put Beis Shammai's opinion first because they acknowledge that it is Torah, even though I have a different interpretation of Torah. Surely if he said Hagar instead of Keturah would have been enough of a departure from the simple words of the pasuk, it would have stimulated the conversation he was looking for. So in order to understand this, we've already spoken about the concept of giving birth, and that's where the story of Keturah is introduced at the time of giving birth. There's another kind of giving birth that isn't just simply about having children, it's about educating people. So we'll understand it based on that well-known saying of our sages, as kol amelamed ben chavera Torah, any person who teaches his friend's child Torah, the Torah considers it as if he birthed that person. Why? How's that possible? It sounds like a very radical thing to say. Because when a person learns Torah properly, they become a whole new person. It's as if you've given birth to a new person. Now, you could say that there are nuances over here. The fact that it says anybody who educates or teaches his friend's child Torah is mashma filoib de ben chavero chena yediyah in Torah. If it says anybody who teaches Torah, that implies even if the child already knows something from before. Is a sabbath movement beikar ba'azavos is busy. It's not given shaykh tzelimed Torah, but we'll appreciate that the main thrust and message of this statement is if you're teaching somebody who has no prior Torah knowledge, then it's like you are bringing them to life. It's as if you've given birth to them. Because as we mentioned, that's when you make somebody brand new. Whereas if the person has already a little experience and has previously learned Torah, then obviously you're just adding to what is already there. And by the way, the mitzvah verstandig the shina alosh and pirshashi oif ve'ele toldes Aaron or Moshe. This helps us to understand also a little nuance of the different expressions that Rashi uses in Bamidbar when it talks about the children of Aaron and Moshe. Says Rashi, V'nikru told us Moshe, the first Rashi says that they were considered the children of Moshe. We're talking about Aaron's sons, and yet they're considered the children of Moshe. Lefishilim dan Torah, because he taught them Torah, Melamed shekol ha-melamed chulei mailol avakasuv ke'ilu yelodai. That anybody who teaches any person Torah, it is ke'ilu, similar to as if he had given birth to him. And then in the next Rashi, B'yom Dibra Hashem es Moshe, on the day that it says that Hashem started to teach Torah to Moshe, there Rashi says, Nasu Elu Ha Toldoi Shaloi. Then it says that Aaron's children became his children. By Bnei Aaron Zoktet Dem Loshen Nasu Elu Toldoi Shaloi. When he talks about the principle, anybody who teaches Torah, he says, it's as if you gave birth to them. When he talks about Aaron's sons and their relationship to Moshe, there he says, he gave birth to them. Nitno Ke'ilu. Why the distinction between Aaron's sons, who are considered Moshe's, at least spiritual children, and everybody else is considered as if they were given birth, is a time, but a very simple, honest reason. Because this is the day that Hashem speaks to Moshe. So it's brand new information for everybody, and certainly then Aaron's sons are learning this Torah for the first time. For Moshe, they're learning Torah from Moshe in a brand new way because nobody's ever learned Torah before. Then they for sure Moshe's children without an as if. Whereas when we speak generically and say any person who educates his friend's child with Torah, which could be in any which way, including people who already know a lot of Torah, is so therefore we'll only consider it as if they gave birth. Okay, what's relevant to us is when do you really give birth to somebody by teaching them? When you teach them from scratch. That's the story of Rabbi Tarfon and his nephews. Das ist echt der Bir in dem Sipranal. Rabbi Tarfon hat gesehen, as Bnei Achsei sei nicht scheich zu Divra v'avonos HaTorah. Rabbi Tarfon sitting there with his nephews and he realizes, blank stares, these are people who do not begin to comprehend or relate to Torah. Because they related to him, he wants to have an impact, he wants to change that. He wants to open their minds to learn Torah. Then ke'ilo yulodo, he wants to create new people of you, as if he's giving birth to them. How does he do it? So he decided he was going to use something within the Torah that speaks to the same theme. The story of Avraham Avinu taking another wife, where the story is about giving birth to new people, because that's what Rabbi Tarfon wants to do with his nephews. He wants to transform them into brand new people. So therefore Rabbi Tarfon decided he's going to do something proactive. He starts a conversation. He wants to start a conversation so they'll also start speaking words of Torah, which will be as if he's bringing them to life, as if he's giving birth to them. That's his intention. Once we know his intention, we can understand the wording that he used. For a start, why he said, he misquoted the pasuk deliberately by saying that Avraham Avinu's wife was Yochni and not saying Hagar. The Gemara sagt in Soita, Gemara Soita tells us, as Amona Shevavis, that you have this mischievous, or the neighborhood mischievous, widow, who's one of the people who destroys the world, is from the Mevale Olam. Says the Gemara, who's an example, could go in Yochni Basrativi. His Rashi says, who's Yochni Basrativi and what did she do? So Rashi tells us, Amona Machshefa Hoisa, she was a widow who was also involved in sorcery. When it was time for a woman to give birth, she would do some kind of a sorcerous spell that would prevent the baby from being born. When this woman was now, as you can imagine, in intense pain, then she would say, let me go daven on your behalf. I don't know, maybe they will listen to me. So she'd go, she'd undo the sorcerer's spell, and the baby would come out healthy, and everybody thought she was a tzaddikus, until one day they bust her. One day they found her doing her shtick. So what's Yochni Basrativi's intention? She wants to give the impression that these births were all miraculous, as a result of her davening. That's why she got the name Yochni. Probably wasn't her birth name. It's the name the Gemara uses to refer to her. Why Yochni? Because the Namen Yochni weist auf einen von Ness. that name Yochni links to the theme of a miracle. This is verstanden von der, was die Gemara sagt in Brachos. As we know, the Gemara Brachos talks about all kinds of things that a person might see in a dream and what they symbolize. So it says, Haraya huna b'chaloim. If a person sees huna in a dream, neis nasalo, it means that a miracle will happen to them because there's a nun in that name, and a nun represents the word neis. Yochanan. If a person sees Yochanan in a dream, which has two nuns, then nisei nisim nasalo will be miracles upon miracles. So from that we could extrapolate that oichat lashon yochni ashaychas miyechedes zum inyan von hiladas banim. So we got yochni related to miracles, and now we have yochni also associated from the story with birth. Not only because of this story of Yochni Basrativi, but also via state Hayalodim Ashechonan Lekimas Avdecha in Parashas Vayechi, where Yosef says to Yaakov his father, "These are the children that the Eibishter graciously gave to your servant." In other words, Chonan, Yochni, all from the same fundamental root, Ches, Nun. That is a symbol of giving birth. On the far, because of this link between Yochni and birth, and specifically miraculous birth, hat Rabbi Tarfon gesagt to Shema Yochni. That's why when Rabbi Tarfon decided he was going to catch their eye by misquoting a pasuk, he didn't call the person Hagar, he called her Yochni. Why? Because it's to the theme of what Rabbi Yochanan wants, of what Rabbi Tarfon wants to do. He wants to, as if he's birthing them, create new people through teaching them. And in their case, specifically, it's completely unnatural because he could see there are people who don't relate to all of this. And with that in mind, we can understand how the story ended. So they correct him, the nephews, and they say, no, it's not Yochni, it's Keturah. That's what the pasuk says. So Rabbi Tarfon says, you children of Keturah. Oib Keturah ksiv. If all you're seeing in place of Yochni, which is supposed to be the symbol of birth, you're still seeing Keturah l'shen kshira, that things are still bound. Oitzeres rachma, infertility, unable to give birth, like Yochni did to these people. Heifech von Yochni was tut helada kenal, which is the opposite of Yochni, which is supposed to be the symbol of giving birth. That indicates you're not going to open your minds to be able to learn Torah as I'd hoped. To expand your minds to be able to understand Torah. He says you're still going to be stuck as children of Keturah, bound, blocked, tied up minds. With a verstoppte Kopf that cannot understand and learn Torah. So that's what, unfortunately, Rabbi Tarfon had to conclude at the end of the story. Now, now let's go back to what we explained about Vayosef Avraham, that it's a whole new dimension of holiness he brings both into his own life and then into the world. We can plug that back in to what we call the real geschmack of Rashi, Yeina Shel Torah, the wine of Torah that Rashi teaches. Because what Avraham Avinu needed to achieve was something brand new, like giving birth in the world. And he was going to do this by transforming the ultimate, absolute impurity to become holy. We already mentioned something had to fundamentally change, and Avraham Avinu had to experience a whole new dimension of holiness in his own life, the essence of Hashem being revealed. We could use that to explain, and in a deeper way, why it is that when Rabbi Tarfon, in his endeavor to wake his nephews to be aware of Torah, he didn't only speak about the fact that Avraham took a wife called Yochni, but he added Vayosef Avraham. Why Vayosef Avraham? If he wanted to get their attention, he could have skipped the word Vayosef Avraham, the words Vayosef Avraham. He could have just said he took a wife and her name was Yochni. They should have known which pasuk he was referring to. Because the only pasuk in the whole Tanakh that has that formula, Vayikach Isho Shmo. Why did he add Vayosef Avraham? For the same reason, Yosef Avraham. In order for him to succeed in teaching his child, or his friend's child, in this case his sister's children, Torah, which in this particular case, because of their inability to really learn and understand, it was to introduce something brand new. Then, like Avraham Avinu, Rabbi Tarfon first had to upgrade himself. Only with the power of personal elevation and growth would he be able to stand a chance to elevate and grow others. In order to achieve that in his own experience, he had to quote part of Torah that speaks about that kind of a thing. Yosef Avraham, where Avraham added to his own spiritual greatness and growth and insight, and only through that was he able to take another wife. The fact that Avraham Avinu added to his spiritual stature, that brought about the possibility that he could marry a woman which would create the potential for generating something brand new in the world, birth and renewal and innovation. And that's exactly what Rabbi Tarfon hoped to do for himself. And with that in mind, we can also explain in Dem was Korealem B'nei Keturah a deeper and more positive explanation of why he called them afterwards B'nei Keturah. The Rambam paskent as B'nei Keturah Shem Zareth Shel Avram Chayovim B'Mila. The Rambam tells us that Keturah's children, being also children of Avraham Avinu, are required to do a bris milah. Das says, in other words, as durch Vayosef Avram Aikachisha Shma Keturah, through this marriage, which on a deeper level represents introducing something so radical into the world that is outside of the entire structure of spirituality, was so effective. It was so effective that the results should be who? Children of Keturah, people who have a mitzvah of a bris. And a bris is not just any mitzvah. The word milah is an abbreviation of the pasuk that says, who will take us up into the heavens, implying that milah elevates us in an incredible way. So incredible, that it's the last letters of those words that spell Hashem's name, implying that we're elevated through milah even beyond Hashem's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei. It says, it elevates us beyond Torah and beyond Yud Kei Vav Kei. That says, beyond the entire created structure, including the spiritual structures. And thus, how does that work? How does a person get catapulted so high? Through a bris milah, which in spiritual terms represents the concept of tshuva, circumcising, revealing, exposing the depth of the heart. So therefore, Rabbi Tarfon was not just insulting them and saying, B'nei Keturah, you're stuck in the world of Keturah, being bound and you can't escape it. Rabbi Tarfon he called, he brought, he kind of invited into the space as the possibility for Torah learning completely beyond the existing structure. In the existing structure, they were stuck. He brings into their world the possibility of doing a bris, cutting away that impediment to learning. Similar to what Avraham Avinu was able to achieve with B'nei Keturah, who are Chayovim B'Milah, who have access to the concept of Milah, and Rabbi Tarfon was able to bring that to his nephews too, which of course is a great lesson for ourselves. If we want to have an impact on somebody else who we feel is stuck, we have to first elevate ourselves to such an incredible level that we can bring them to a point that is beyond the natural status in which they find themselves.